He was about to sign without understanding Chinese until the coffee lady's son took control. Don't forget to comment which country you're watching us from. It all started in an elegant boardroom on the 23rd floor. Edward Mitchell, CEO of a company on the brink of bankruptcy, held a golden pen in his hand. In front of him, 3 Chinese businessmen in perfect suits watched him with cold smiles. Between them lay a 120-page contract, all in Chinese characters. Edward didn't understand a single word, but the numbers he could read said $50 million. His salvation. His company was dying, $4 million in debt, 70 employees who depended on him. This contract was his only hope. The ink moved closer to the paper, then the door burst open. An 11-year-old boy came running in. Worn sneakers, cheap t-shirt, the son of the woman who served coffee, someone who should never be there. The boy shouted something in Chinese with desperation. The businessmen ignored him with contempt, but Edward, by instinct, pulled out his phone. He activated the automatic translator. The mechanical voice translated the boy's words. "They're going to steal everything from you. That contract is fake. Please don't sign." Edward froze. The pen trembled in his hand. The businessman turned pale. A boy that nobody saw had just saved a man who had never noticed him. But to understand how this invisible child changed a millionaire's destiny, and how a humble woman became the key to everything, we need to know the complete story. If you're moved by stories where the invisible become heroes, stay until the end. Because this story has a truth that comes to light and a twist that will make you cry with emotion. Here we tell stories that heal your soul, that remind you that humility also has power, and that a second chance can change everything. 6 hours earlier, Edward Mitchell looked at himself in the marble mirror of his office and saw the ghost of what he once was. His 42 years had been generous with him in terms of money, but cruel in terms of soul. Success had been his drug, and now he suffered the most painful withdrawal syndrome that exists, emotional and financial bankruptcy. His company, Mitchell and Associates, had been his life for 15 years. He had built it brick by brick, sacrificing marriages, friendships, and all the small joys that make life worth living. But the last 2 years had been a tsunami of bad decisions, lost contracts, and unfair competition that had swept everything in its path. The red numbers danced on his computer like mocking demons. $4 million in debt, 70 employees who depended on him, buildings to mortgage, a reputation that crumbled like a sandcastle under rain. It was strange how silence could be so loud. His office, which once vibrated with the bustle of success, now breathed with the deadly silence of a corporate cemetery. His employees walked through the hallways like zombies, knowing that each day could be the last. But that morning, when he had lost all hope, his phone rang. A voice with an Asian accent told him about a unique opportunity. 3 Chinese businessmen, representatives of an international conglomerate, were interested in investing in his company. $50 million on the table. A $1 million contract that could rescue him from the abyss. Edward hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were swollen from insomnia and worry, but suddenly they shone again with a hope he thought was lost forever. It was as if he had been drowning in a dark ocean and someone had thrown him a golden life preserver. The meeting was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. Edward arrived 20 minutes late, not from arrogance, but because he had to calm Sarah, his secretary, who was crying at her desk seeing the foreclosure letters that arrived every day like ravens bearing bad news. The 3 businessmen waited for him in the boardroom with the patience of experienced hunters. They were middle-aged men, dressed in suits that probably cost more than the annual salary of any of his employees. Their smiles were perfect, too perfect, like mannequins in luxury stores. The group's leader, a man with gold glasses and a frightening calm, extended his hand. His grip was firm but cold, like touching an iceberg in human form. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, with impeccable but mechanical English. "We have studied your company. We see potential, much potential." The words sounded like heavenly music to Edward. For the first time in months, he felt he could breathe without his chest hurting. The businessmen spread out documents, charts, financial projections, showing a golden future. They talked about international expansion, Asian markets, opportunities that would make his company not just survive, but flourish like never before. Edward listened with the bright eyes of a child on Christmas. Every word was like fresh water for a man who had been walking through the desert for years. He didn't want to ask difficult questions. He didn't want to look for fine print. He just wanted to sign, be saved, become the successful Edward Mitchell he had been before. The contract was written in Chinese, with an English translation that seemed made by a robot. Edward knew he should have reviewed it with lawyers, studied it line by line, but desperation is a powerful drug that clouds the clearest judgment. "It's our company protocol," explained the leader, with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. "In China, official documents are written in our language. But don't worry, the translation is exact." Edward nodded like a puppet. His hand trembled when he took the pen. It was a gold Mont Blanc that weighed like destiny itself between his fingers. The numbers danced in his head. 50 million, salvation, future, hope. But at that moment, while the ink approached the paper like a bullet toward its target, he felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching him, as if invisible eyes had detected a danger he couldn't see. And while the golden tip of the pen touched the paper, a childish gaze, from afar, already knew something wasn't right. In the same building, but in a completely different world, Maria Rodriguez pushed her coffee cart through the hallways, like a benevolent ghost that nobody noticed. Her 35 years had been a constant war against social invisibility, a daily battle to maintain dignity while the world treated her like part of the furniture. She had worked at Mitchell & Associates for 3 years, serving coffee, cleaning offices, being the invisible woman who kept functioning a world that pretended she didn't exist. Executives passed by her as if she were air. Employees asked for their coffee without even looking her in the eyes. And Edward Mitchell didn't even know her name. But Maria had a secret that made her richer than all the millionaires in the building. She had Diego. Her 11-year-old son was her personal sun in the middle of an always cloudy sky. Diego's eyes shone with an intelligence that cut like a diamond, and his heart had the purity that only children who have learned to value small things preserve, because big things have never been within their reach. Diego was the result of a youthful love that ended when the father discovered that being a dad required more courage than creating a baby. Since then, Maria had been mother and father, worker and protector, the sun and moon in the tiny but perfect universe they had built together. That October afternoon, like so many others, Diego accompanied her to work because he had nowhere else to go. School had ended at 2. And she couldn't afford a babysitter, so the boy hid in the small staff break room, doing homework and reading used books they bought at flea markets on Sundays. Maria pushed her cart toward conference room number 12, where she knew Edward had an important meeting. She had seen the 3 Asian men arrive that morning with their expensive suits and leather briefcases that screamed money. In her world of invisibility, she saw everything, because nobody bothered to hide anything from someone they considered non-existent. While preparing the coffee tray in the small kitchen on the floor, she felt something wasn't right. It was a feminine intuition, that ancestral wisdom that mothers develop when they have to protect their children from the world. The Chinese businessmen spoke in low voices in the hallway, and although she didn't understand their language, the tone of their voices made her skin crawl like a silent threat. Diego looked up from his book when she entered the break room. His eyes, large and expressive like his grandfather's, immediately caught the worry on his mother's face. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked with that voice that still preserved childhood sweetness, but already had the gravity of someone who had grown up too fast. "Nothing, sweetheart," Maria lied, ruffling his black-as-night hair. "It's just that Mr. Mitchell has a very important meeting today." Diego nodded and returned to his book, but his ears stayed alert. He was a curious child, one of those who listen to conversations they shouldn't hear and catch details that adults overlook. And he had a special talent that not even his own mother fully knew. His paternal grandfather, before dying when Diego was 7, had lived 10 years in China working in construction. During those long and painful afternoons in the hospital, while cancer slowly took him away, the old man had taught Diego words in Chinese, not formally but through games, songs, stories of dragons and warriors that made the boy forget for moments that his grandfather was dying. After his grandfather's death, Diego had continued studying Chinese on his own. He watched videos online, used free apps, read translated comics. It was his way of keeping alive the memory of the only man who had been like a father to him. His way of honoring someone who had taught him that knowledge was the only treasure nobody could steal from him. But that day, while his mother served coffee and he pretended to read about mathematics, Diego heard something that made his blood freeze. The 3 Chinese businessmen were talking in the hallway just outside the break room. They spoke in Chinese, sure that nobody understood them, with the arrogance of hunters discussing their strategy in front of the animal they're going to hunt. Diego understood every word, and what he heard filled him with a terror he didn't know how to handle. They talked about deception, about theft, about a contract that wasn't what it seemed. They mentioned numbers, percentages, hidden clauses that would turn Mr. Mitchell into their employee instead of their partner. They laughed with that cold laugh that sharks have when they smell blood in the water. The humble child that nobody saw had just discovered that the invisible are sometimes the only ones who can see the truth. His heart beat like a war drum. His small hands trembled as he closed the book. He knew he had to do something, but who would believe a poor boy? Who would listen to the voice of someone who shouldn't even be there? But as the voices moved away toward the conference room, Diego made the bravest decision of his short life. And at that moment, Diego knew that if he didn't do something, everything would collapse. Diego left the break room like a small soldier entering battle. His worn sneakers made no noise against the marble hallway, but his heart beat so loud he was sure the entire building could hear it. First, he went to his mother. Maria was in the kitchen, washing coffee cups with the meticulousness of someone who has learned that doing small things well is the only way to maintain dignity when the world treats you as if you were small. "Mom," Diego whispered, pulling at her light blue uniform, "I have to tell you something very important." Maria looked at him with that tired smile that working mothers have at the end of a long day. "Tell me, honey, but quickly because I have to take more coffee to room 12. The Chinese gentlemen. They're lying. They're going to steal Mr. Mitchell's company. I heard everything they said." Maria stood still for a second, but then shook her head like someone shooing away a bothersome fly. "Diego, sweetheart, you can't go around listening to adult conversations. And besides, you don't know Chinese." "But I do know," insisted the boy, with that desperation children feel when adults don't take them seriously. "Grandpa taught me, remember? And then I kept learning on my own." Maria sighed. Her son was brilliant, she knew that, but he also had an imagination that sometimes took him down strange paths. And besides, she couldn't afford to get into trouble. She needed that job more than the air she breathed. "Diego, listen to me carefully," she said, putting her hands on his small shoulders. "We are the people who serve coffee, not the ones who make important decisions. We can't get involved in boss matters." But Diego had inherited his mother's stubbornness and his grandfather's determination. If she wouldn't believe him, he would find someone who would. He ran to Sarah's desk, Edward's secretary. She was an older woman, one of those who have seen so much in life that nothing surprises them anymore. She was organizing papers with the sadness of someone who knows that soon she won't have papers to organize. "Mrs. Sarah," Diego said, breathing heavily, "I need to talk to Mr. Mitchell. It's very urgent." Sarah looked up from her documents and saw the boy with the same expression one looks at a lost puppy, with tenderness, but without really taking it seriously. "Oh, honey, Mr. Mitchell is in a very important meeting. He can't be bothered for anything in the world." "But that's exactly why," shouted Diego, with the frustration of someone who has the truth in their hands but can't find anyone who wants to receive it. "The meeting is a trap. The Chinese gentlemen are going to deceive him." Sarah smiled with that condescending smile adults use with children when they say things they consider impossible. "Diego, my child, those gentlemen are very serious businessmen who come from very far away to help Mr. Mitchell. Don't say such ugly things." But Diego didn't give up. He ran to other employees, secretaries, assistants. They all looked at him with the same mixture of affection and dismissal. He was just a boy, the son of the coffee lady, someone who didn't understand the adult world and its complicated matters. "The gentleman said the contract has hidden clauses," Diego shouted, but his words were lost in the air like dry leaves carried by the wind. "They said that when Mr. Mitchell can't pay, they'll keep the entire company." But nobody listened to him. Or rather, everyone heard him, but nobody believed him. He was the unexpected hero trying to save the day, but facing the most difficult wall to break: adult disbelief in the wisdom of a child. Minutes passed like torture. Diego knew that in the conference room, Edward Mitchell was about to sign his corporate death sentence. He could imagine him, with the pen in his hand, smiling with the hope of someone who believes he's being saved when he's actually being devoured. The humility that had marked his entire life suddenly transformed into a powerful force. If nobody was going to listen to him through intermediaries, he would have to speak directly with the source of the problem. He ran toward conference room number 12 with the determination of a warrior who knows he's fighting the most important battle of his life. His small legs moved like pistons. His breathing became agitated like a marathon runner's, but his will was stronger than any fatigue. When he reached the glass door, he saw the scene that terrified him. Edward Mitchell had the pen in his hand, the golden tip millimeters from the paper. The three Chinese businessmen watched him with those shark smiles that Diego had learned to recognize. There was no time for protocols, no time to ask permission, no time for a humble child to act as if he were invisible. He burst the door open and shouted with all the strength of his lungs. But he shouted in Chinese because he knew it was the only way for the real villains to understand that he knew the truth. His words came out like bullets of honesty. "They're going to steal everything from you. That contract is fake. Please don't sign." And what the translator said next made everyone freeze. The silence that followed was so dense it seemed solid. Edward Mitchell looked at his phone screen as if it were a window to another dimension. The automatic translator's words floated in the air like accusing ghosts, repeated over and over in that mechanical voice that made the truth sound even more terrible. "They're going to steal everything from you. That contract is fake. Please don't sign." The three Chinese businessmen had transformed from confident hunters into cornered animals. Their perfect smiles vanished like makeup under rain, and for the first time since they had entered that room, they seemed human. Scared humans, discovered humans, humans whose mask had just fallen with a crash. Edward looked up from the phone and stared at the boy who had burst into his life like a small guardian angel. Diego stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, cheeks red from running and eyes bright with tears of frustration he had been holding back for the last hour. "What else did they say?" Edward asked with a voice he didn't recognize as his own. It was deeper, colder, more dangerous. Diego swallowed and spoke in Chinese again, this time slower, looking directly at the three businessmen who watched him with a mixture of shock and terror. His words were precise, like scalpels, cutting through the air with the truth they had kept hidden. The automatic translator continued doing its job with that cruel impartiality of technology. They said that when you can't pay the interest, they'll keep 100% of the company. They said you're stupid and desperate. They said Americans always fall for the same trap. Edward felt as if they had poured a bucket of ice water over him. His blood turned to ice, but his mind, for the first time in months, became crystal clear. The desperation that had blinded him for weeks evaporated like fog under the sun, and in its place appeared a mental clarity he hadn't felt in years. He slowly rose from his chair, like a lion who had just realized that the hyenas surrounding him were not allies, but predators. His height of 6'2" had never seemed as useful as at that moment. The Chinese businessman, who until a minute ago had looked at him like easy prey, now had to look up to find his eyes. "Is it true?" Edward asked. But it wasn't really a question. It was an accusation in the form of an interrogation. The group's leader, the man with the gold glasses, tried to regain his composure. His smile returned like an actor returning to the stage after forgetting his line. "Mr. Mitchell, that boy obviously doesn't understand." "Shut up!" Edward roared with a voice that made the window glass tremble. "Don't lie to me again." He took the 120-page contract and flipped through it with a fury that gave him superhuman concentration. His eyes, trained by 15 years of reading legal documents, began to find the discrepancies between the Chinese text and the English translation. There it was. On page 47, hidden among paragraphs of legal jargon that seemed innocuous, was the clause that would have destroyed him forever. The English translation spoke of joint participation and shared benefits. But when he put the Chinese text through his translator, the reality was very different. The real clause said that if Edward couldn't meet monthly payments of $2 million for 6 consecutive months, ownership of the company would transfer automatically and completely to the Chinese conglomerate. They hadn't come to save him. They had come to buy him piece by piece, like vultures patiently waiting for their prey to finish dying. "Sons of bitches!" Edward shouted, and the words came from his throat like lava from a volcano. It was the first time in years he had said a bad word, but it was also the first time in years he felt completely alive. One of the businessmen got up and started walking toward the exit, but Edward was faster. He closed the door with a bang that resonated like thunder and stood between them and freedom. "Nobody moves until you explain to me exactly how you plan to rob me." At that moment, Maria appeared at the door. She had heard the shouting from the hallway and came running with the panic of a mother who knows her son is in trouble. When she saw Diego in the middle of that room full of tension and angry men, her maternal instinct activated like an alarm system. "Diego!" she shouted, running toward him to protect him with her own body. "My boy, come here!" But Diego, for the first time in his life, felt like a real hero. He stayed firm in his place, looking at the Chinese businessmen with a courage he didn't know he had. "It's okay, Mom," he said with a voice that sounded more mature than it should sound at 11 years old. "I told Mr. Mitchell the truth. The bad men were going to steal everything from him." Edward looked at Maria for the first time in 3 years, really looked at her, not as the invisible furniture she had always been, but as the woman who had raised the boy who had just saved his life. Her eyes were deep as wells, tired but full of a dignity that no circumstance had been able to break. Her light blue uniform was wrinkled from the day's work, but she wore the clothes as if it were a gala dress, and in her protective arms, hugging her son as if he were the most valuable thing in the universe, Edward saw something he had forgotten existed: true love. "Your son just saved me from ruin," Edward told Maria, and his voice trembled with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "Your son is a hero." The Chinese businessman took advantage of the emotional distraction to try to slip away, but Edward had called security. The building guards, large and serious men who had been waiting for orders in the hallway, blocked all exits. The hidden betrayal had come to light. Truth had triumphed over deception, and a humble child that nobody had ever seen had just demonstrated that sometimes the invisible are the only ones who can see what really matters. But the decision Edward would make next wasn't in any contract. 3 hours later, when the police had taken away the 3 businessmen and the lawyers had finished documenting the fraud attempt, Edward found himself alone in his office with Maria and Diego. The building was empty, immersed in that quietness that workplaces have when the official day has ended, but real life is just beginning. The neon lights created soft shadows on the walls, and for the first time in months, Edward didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The company still had problems, still needed salvation. But now he knew that true salvation doesn't come from million-dollar contracts signed with strangers. It comes from people who know you and decide to stay by your side despite everything. Maria was sitting in one of the leather chairs in front of his desk, with Diego curled against her side like a kitten who had had a very long day. Both looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and fatigue, not knowing quite what to expect from that powerful man who had suddenly invited them into his private world. Edward studied them for a moment that felt eternal. For 3 years, he had passed by Maria thousands of times without really seeing her. She had been part of the landscape, like decorative plants or paintings on walls. But now, seeing her under the golden light of his desk lamp, he realized he had been blind to a beauty that had nothing to do with money or status. Maria had the natural elegance of women who have learned to be strong without losing tenderness. Her hands, calloused from work but cared for with the meticulousness of someone who respects her own body, rested protectively on her son's shoulders. Her brown eyes had that depth that only people who have cried a lot but haven't lost the ability to laugh develop. "Maria," Edward said, and his voice sounded different when he pronounced her name. Softer, more human. "For 3 years you have taken care of this company better than I have. You've arrived early, left late, kept everything functioning while I got lost in numbers and ambitions." Maria looked at him with surprise. She wasn't used to bosses talking to her as if she were a real person with feelings and self-worth. "I just do my job, Mr. Mitchell," she murmured, with that automatic humility that people who have been invisible for too long develop. "No," Edward said, getting up from his chair and walking toward the window that showed the illuminated city. "You've done much more than your job. And your son." He turned to look at Diego, who watched him with those big eyes full of childish curiosity. "Your son saved my life today." Edward approached them and knelt in front of the chair where they were sitting. It was a strange image, a millionaire CEO kneeling before a cleaning lady and her son, but it was also the most honest image he had starred in for years. "Diego," he said to the boy, "how did you learn Chinese so well?" Diego's eyes lit up with that joy children have when finally someone asks them about something they really care about. "My grandfather lived in China for 10 years before I was born," he explained with the seriousness of a small professor. "When he was sick in the hospital, he taught me words and songs so I wouldn't feel sad. Later, when he died, I kept studying alone because it was like having him with me still." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. That boy had turned his pain into wisdom, his loss into strength. He had taken the lessons of a dying grandfather and transformed them into the weapon that would save a stranger from ruin. "And why did you help me?" Edward asked. I was never kind to you. I didn't even know you existed." Diego looked at him with that brutal honesty that only children have when they decide to tell the complete truth. "Because my mum says that when you can help someone, you have to do it, even if that person doesn't know you, even if that person has never helped you." The boy's words floated in the air like church bells, resonating with a truth that Edward had forgotten existed. In his world of contracts and competition, he had lost the most basic notion of humanity, that we help because we can help, not because we expect something in return. "Maria," Edward said, turning his attention to the mother, "I have a proposal for you." Maria tensed. In her experience, when bosses had proposals, it generally meant more work for the same money, or changes that would make her life more difficult. "I don't want you to continue working as coffee service manager," Edward continued, and Maria felt as if the ground was moving under her feet. Was he firing her, after her son had saved him? "I want you to be my executive assistant," Edward said, and the words came from his mouth as if they had been waiting years to be pronounced. "I want you to help me run this company, because for 3 years you've seen everything that happens here. You've seen my mistakes, my successes, my weaknesses, and despite all that, your son risked everything to save me." Maria looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't have a college education. I don't know about business. I don't know—" "Do you know how to be honest?" Edward interrupted her. "Yes." "Do you know how to work hard?" "Yes." "Do you know how to take care of people who matter?" Maria looked at her son and smiled with a tenderness that illuminated the entire office. "Yes." "Then you know everything you need to know," Edward said. "The rest can be learned." But there was something more. Edward got up and walked to his desk, where he kept the most important documents of his life. He took out an envelope that had been waiting for the right moment for months, although until that day he hadn't known what that right moment would be. "There's something else," he said, returning to them with the envelope in his hands. "6 months ago, my lawyer made me update my will. I have no family, no heirs, nobody who really knows me or cares about me." He opened the envelope and took out several legal documents. His hands trembled slightly as he extended them toward Maria. "If something happens to me, I want you and Diego to keep the company, the entire company." The silence that followed was so deep they could hear their own heartbeats. Maria looked at the documents as if they were alien artifacts, impossible to understand. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered, "I can't accept this. It's too much. It's right," Edward said, and for the first time in years, he was completely sure of something. "For 15 years I built this company thinking only of myself. I turned it into a monster that devoured everything in its path, including my own humanity. But today, an 11-year-old boy taught me that true success isn't measured in money. It's measured in how many people one leaves better in the world." He knelt again in front of them, but this time it wasn't a boss talking to employees. It was a man who had found something he didn't know he was looking for. "Maria," he said, and his voice trembled with an emotion that had been stored for decades. "I don't know if it's too soon to say this, but I think I've fallen in love with you. Not with the invisible woman who served coffee, but with the real woman who raised a hero. With the woman who taught her son to help strangers, with the woman who has been stronger than me all these years without me realizing it." Maria looked at him with tears in her eyes. They were tears of shock, of hope, of fear, and of a happiness so great she didn't know how to contain it. "What are you asking me?" she whispered. "I'm asking you to give me a chance," Edward said. "Not as your boss, but as a man who wants to learn to be a better person, as someone who wants to form a real family, as someone who wants to sign the only contract that really matters, the contract of love." Diego, who had been listening in silence like a small, wise man, got up from his mother's chair and walked toward Edward. Without saying a word, he hugged him with that strength children have when they hug with all their heart. "Does that mean I finally have a dad?" Diego asked, with his voice muffled against Edward's chest. Edward felt as if all the tears he hadn't cried for years came out at once. He hugged the boy with an intensity that surprised him, feeling how his stone heart melted like ice under the sun. "Yes, champion," he whispered against Diego's black hair. Now you have a dad. If your mom wants, now we're a family." Maria slowly got up from her chair. Her legs trembled, her hands trembled, her whole world trembled because it was changing in ways she had never dreamed possible. She approached the two of them, her son hugging the man who had just offered them not only work, not only money, but something much more valuable, an opportunity to be happy. "Edward," she said, using his name for the first time, and the word sounded like music in the silent air of the office. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure about us?" Edward looked at her over Diego's head, with eyes that shone with a certainty he had never felt before in his life. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. "For years I signed million-dollar contracts that meant nothing, but this is the only contract I really want to sign." And there, in an office illuminated by the lights of a city that never sleeps, three people who had been alone discovered that sometimes real family isn't born from blood, but from the decision to take care of each other. Redemption had come in the most unexpected way, through a humble child who had had the courage to speak when nobody else wanted to listen, and from an invisible woman who had raised a hero without knowing she was one. "I didn't save my company," Edward thought while hugging his new family. "They saved me." 6 months later, Edward Mitchell's office had changed so much it seemed like a completely different place. The cold grey walls now had family photographs, Diego's drawings stuck with magnets on a corkboard, and green plants that Maria cared for with the same dedication she put into everything she loved. The company had also changed. It was no longer the humanity-devouring monster it had been before. Under the new joint administration of Edward and Maria, it had become a place where employees had names instead of numbers, where families were welcome, where success was measured not only in profits, but in the happiness of the people who worked there. Edward had discovered that Maria had a natural intelligence for business that no university could have taught. She saw patterns he overlooked, understood people in a way that administration manuals never explained, and had an honesty that cut through corporate lies like a hot knife through butter. But the biggest change wasn't in the company. It was in the 3-bedroom apartment they had bought together in a neighborhood where children could play in the street without danger and where neighbors knew each other by their names. It was a Saturday morning, and Edward was in the kitchen making pancakes while Maria read the newspaper at the breakfast table. Diego was on the living room floor, building a Lego castle he had been planning for weeks. Sunlight came through the windows like golden honey, and the aroma of coffee, mixed with the smell of pancakes, created that home atmosphere that Edward had never known, but now couldn't imagine living without. "You know what?" Edward said, flipping a pancake with the expertise of someone who had discovered late the pleasure of cooking for the people he loves. "What?" Maria asked, looking up from the newspaper with that smile that still surprised him every day with its simple beauty. "I think I'm the luckiest person in the world." Maria laughed with that laugh that sounded like wind chimes. "Oh, really? And why?" "Because I have a family I didn't deserve, a wife who's smarter than me, and a son who saved my life." Diego looked up from his Legos. "Dad, you don't have to thank me every day anymore. I already told you heroes don't need to be thanked." Edward and Maria looked at each other and burst into laughter. In the 6 months they had been together, Diego had developed a personality that mixed adult wisdom with childish innocence, and constantly surprised them with observations that made them see the world in completely new ways. "You're right, champion," Edward said, serving pancakes on 3 different plates. "But let me tell you something. You didn't just save me from those bad businessmen, you saved me from myself." "How?" Diego asked, approaching the table with hands full of Lego pieces. "You taught me that being successful doesn't mean having a lot of money. It means having people who love you, and people you love too." Diego nodded solemnly, as if he had understood a universal truth. "Grandpa told me the same thing. He said money is like water. It's good to have it, but if you only think about that, you can drown." Edward looked at Maria with admiration. "Where does he get these things?" "From his grandfather," Maria replied, ruffling her son's hair. That man knew more about life than all philosophy books combined. While they had breakfast, Edward reflected on how he had gotten there. 6 months before, he had been seconds away from signing a contract that would have destroyed everything he had built. But a boy nobody saw had appeared like a guardian angel to save him. Now, instead of a fraudulent contract, he had signed something much more valuable: the adoption papers that made Diego legally his son, the marriage certificate that made Maria officially his wife, and the documents that made them a real family before the law and before God. "What are you thinking about?" Maria asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "About contracts," Edward replied with a smile. "About how I almost signed the worst contract of my life, and how I ended up signing the best one." "The best one?" Diego asked, with his mouth full of pancake and maple syrup. "Yes," Edward said, extending his arms to hug his wife and son at the same time. "The contract of love, the one that says we're going to take care of each other forever, no matter what happens." "And that contract can't be broken?" Diego asked, with genuine curiosity. "No," Edward said, kissing his son's forehead and then his wife's lips. "That contract is for life." And there, in a kitchen full of sunlight and the smell of pancakes, surrounded by the two people who had transformed his life from an empty millionaire to a truly rich man, Edward Mitchell finally understood that success isn't counted in numbers. It's counted in hugs, in shared laughter, in family breakfasts, and in the certainty that when you come home, there are people waiting for you who are genuinely happy to see you. "I didn't save my company," he thought, while watching Diego explain to Maria the architectural structure of his Lego castle. "They saved me." 5 years later, the Georgia State University auditorium was filled to the last seat. Students, professors, businessmen and media had come to hear the youngest speaker in the institution's history, Diego Mitchell Rodriguez, 16 years old, who would give a lecture on the importance of listening to the invisible. Among the audience in the front row, Edward and Maria watched him with the pride that only parents feel when they see their children have surpassed all their most ambitious dreams. Diego, now a tall and confident teenager, but who preserved the same kindness in his eyes, approached the microphone. He wore an elegant suit, but on his wrist he had the woven bracelet his mother had made him when he was 11, and which he never took off. "Good morning," he began, and his voice filled the auditorium with quiet confidence. "My name is Diego, and when I was 11 years old, my mom was invisible." A murmur of curiosity ran through the audience. She wasn't really invisible, of course, but to the adult world, she didn't exist. She was the woman who served coffee in an important company, and nobody knew her name. Nobody asked her how she was. Nobody really saw her. Edward felt a lump in his throat. After 5 years, he still felt guilty for having been one of those blind adults. "But she taught me something that changed my life, and that later changed the lives of many other people. She taught me that the invisible often see the most. Who understand the most? Who can help the most if someone bothers to listen to them?" Diego paused and searched for his parents' eyes in the audience. He smiled at them with that smile that was still the same as when he was 11 and ran through company hallways to save a stranger. "5 years ago, my family and I created the Diego Foundation. It doesn't bear my name because I'm special, but because it represents something we can all be, the voice that listens to other voices that the world ignores." The foundation had become one of the country's most respected charitable organizations. It had programs for single mothers, scholarships for children from working families, free language courses, and something that was particularly dear to Edward, a program that taught executives to see and value all their employees, not just those in management positions. "In these 5 years, Diego continued, "we have helped 500 single mothers get dignified jobs. We have given scholarships to 1,000 children who had talent but not resources. We have taught 15 different languages to people who never thought they could learn something new." The audience applauded, but Diego gently raised his hand to continue. "But the most important thing we've done is remind people of something very simple, that we are all important, that we all have something valuable to offer, that there are no invisible people, only people who are waiting for someone to see them." Edward took Maria's hand and squeezed it gently. She had become not only his wife, but the Foundation's executive director, and had shown she had a natural talent for administration that had impressed the entire business world. "My adoptive father," Diego said, and Edward felt his chest swell with emotion every time he heard those words, "always says he didn't save his company, that we saved him. But I think we all saved each other." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Because that's the truth about family, about love, about life. Nobody saves themselves alone. We save each other. And sometimes those we least expect are the ones who can save us the most. Diego ended his speech with a quote from his grandfather, translated from Chinese to English: "The water that seems quietest has the strongest currents, and the people who seem smallest have the biggest hearts." The applause was deafening. People stood up, and many had tears in their eyes. But Edward only had eyes for his son, the boy who had grown up to become the kind of man it had taken him 40 years to learn to be. After the conference, while receiving congratulations in the university lobby, an elderly woman approached them. She was elegant, well-dressed, but had that expression of vulnerability that people have when they're about to share something very personal. "Excuse me," she said, addressing all three. "I wanted to thank you. My grandson received a scholarship from your foundation last year. Now he's studying engineering. He's the first in our family to go to college." Maria smiled with that warmth that still melted Edward's heart after 5 years of marriage. "There's nothing to thank. Smart children deserve opportunities, regardless of where they come from." "What's your grandson's name?" Diego asked. "Roberto," the lady replied. "Roberto Sanchez." Diego nodded. "I know him. He's very good at mathematics. He's going to be an excellent engineer." The lady got so emotional she started crying. "You don't understand what this means to us. Roberto was living with his grandmother because his parents... well, because life is sometimes difficult. But now he has a future." Edward looked at his family and felt that deep satisfaction that only comes from knowing your life has a purpose bigger than yourself. That night at home, while Diego did homework in his room and Maria reviewed proposals for new foundation projects, Edward stood on the balcony of their apartment, looking at the city that stretched before him like a sea of lights. Maria came up from behind and hugged him, resting her head on his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, as she had done thousands of times in the last 5 years. "That we're very fortunate," Edward replied, turning to hug her. "That I almost lost all this before knowing it existed. But you didn't lose it." "No," Edward smiled. "A very wise boy saved me. A very wise boy who's now in his room probably studying Chinese for his test tomorrow." They laughed together, as they did almost every night. It was one of those perfect moments that Edward had learned to recognize and treasure. Those moments of simple happiness that are worth more than all the million-dollar contracts in the world. "Edward," Maria said, using that tone she had when she was about to say something important. "Yes? Do you know what my favorite part of these 5 years has been?" "What?" "Seeing how you've become the dad Diego always deserved to have." Edward felt those tears he no longer tried to hide. For 5 years he had cried more than in all his previous life, but they were good tears. Tears of gratitude, of love, of a happiness so great it sometimes didn't fit inside his chest. "And you," he told Maria, "have become the most powerful woman I know, and not because of the foundation, not because of money, but because you have the power to make people feel important. We all have that power. Maria replied. We just sometimes forget to use it. At that moment, Diego came out of his room with a mischievous expression that Edward had already learned to recognize. What are you plotting, champion? He asked. Nothing, Diego said, but his smile gave him away. I just wanted to tell you I love you, and that I'm proud to have the best parents in the world. Edward and Maria looked at each other and then ran toward Diego to hug him in one of those family hugs that last a long time and recharge the soul for the whole week. We love you too, sweetheart, Maria whispered against his hair, which wasn't as black as before, but still smelled like apple shampoo. And we're proud of you, Edward added. Prouder than words can express. And there, on the balcony of a modest but love-filled apartment, a family born from the impossible continued proving that sometimes the happiest endings start with the most unexpected beginnings. Because 5 years before, a humble boy had run through company hallways to save a stranger, and that stranger had turned out to be exactly the dad the boy had been waiting for his whole life. If this story touched your heart, remember that we all have the power to see the invisible. We all have the ability to listen to those nobody listens to, and we all have the opportunity to be the unexpected hero in someone else's life. Because sometimes the most important contracts aren't signed with ink. They're signed with love.